Okay, let's go get going with horseshoe crabs. Welcome, my name is Dave Simpson. I'm the chair of the Horseshoe Crab Committee. First order of business is to approve the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, we'll consider it accepted. Approval of proceedings from our annual meeting. Are there any comments or issues with the proceedings? Seeing none, we'll consider those approved. The next item is public comment for items that are not on the agenda. Are there any sign-ups? Anyone have a comment? One person? Go ahead, please. Items not on the agenda.
Hi, Benji Swan, and I wanted to make a comment on biomedical aspect of it, so should I wait for the discussion?
That would be great. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Public comments, items not on the agenda. I don't see anyone. So we'll step up. The next agenda item is to review the transfer request from North Carolina. Marin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is a transfer request from North Carolina to Georgia. North Carolina exceeded its quota of 24,036 horseshoe crabs in 2013, and this was in most of their horseshoe crabs are caught in the blue crab trawl fishery, and the commercial horseshoe crab fishery was closed on August 1st, but the preliminary trip estimates, so they closed the fishery on August 1st because preliminary trip estimates showed that the quota was close to being exceeded, and the quota was exceeded by approximately 2,247 crabs. So North Carolina has requested a transfer of 3,000 crabs from Georgia, and this request was reviewed by the Shorebird and Horseshoe Crab Advisory Panels, the Horseshoe Crab Technical Committee, and the Plan Review Team. The TC members that reviewed this plan just suggested a reevaluation of the North Carolina quota due to the multiple overages that have occurred. There was a transfer request in 2009, 2011, and 2012. And they just wanted to point out that the current quota of 24,036 crabs is based on the 1998 landings. So a directed fishery seems to be developing, and they had no other concerns with this transfer request. So in conclusion, the Plan Review Team does not oppose the transfer request given the small number of crabs and the previous transfer precedents, but they did suggest that perhaps North Carolina could return to the 2012 management approach, which was having a trip limit of 0 crabs until April 1st and a trip limit of 50 crabs after April 1st. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any questions on the transfer request? Roy, please.
Just so I understand the nature of the request, the Georgia crabs are available from what source in Georgia? Georgia's a de minimis state, if memory serves, correct? So where do the crabs come from in Georgia?
From their quota. It's just a transfer of quota.
Okay. Yeah, Roy, go ahead.
I'm sorry. De minimis states have a quota? Refresh my memory on that.
Georgia is not a de minimis state, I don't believe. So it does have a quota. Sorry.
So with some other species, there's a paperwork process of transfer, offers, and acceptance. Has all that paperwork been filed? And so that would demonstrate that they have sufficient quota to transfer. Are there any limitations on transfer between states? Are there limitations geographically on transfer?
No, there are no such limitations.
Okay, so further questions? Lewis, anything to add on your request?
I'm trying to get to it.
I'm trying to buy you all the time.
I know, and I appreciate it. No, this has just been an ongoing problem, and we're doing our dead level best to limit the fishery. We keep cutting back on the trip limits, and we think we've got a handle on it now. But there had been discussion back earlier on, several years ago, where we had requested, and I can't remember who we requested the crabs from, but the TC did say did reject our request for some crabs out of, I think it was might have been Massachusetts, I can't remember where, but they said we needed to look closer to home for a similar population, and so that's why we've been begging and pleading with Georgia, and they have been very helpful in granting our request. So I would just ask you to. I think I got it under control. So I would appreciate a favorable vote on my motion to accept the North Carolina transfer request.
Okay, and that was your motion?
Yes.
Do we have a second to that motion? Jim. Any discussion on the motion? Okay. Jim Estes from Florida. Okay, so the motion is to move to approve the transfer request from Georgia to North Carolina. Motion by Dr. Daniel, second by Mr. Estes. Discussion on the motion. Do you need time to caucus? All those in favor, please raise your hand. I see 14 in favor. Any opposed? Any abstentions or null votes? Motion passes unanimously, 14-0. Next agenda item is an update on New England and New York stock trends, and John's going to take that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. In 2013, and at the last management board meeting, we presented, or Penny Howell, the TC chair, presented the 2013 Horseshoe Crab Stock Assessment Update. And the majority of that update used ARIMA modeling, that's Autoregressive Integrated Moving Average modeling, to examine trends in abundance indices up and down the coast. And ultimately, it estimated the probability that the terminal year of an index of being below either an index-based reference point, which we chose the 25th percentile, or the 1998 index value. And the reason why we used 1998 level as an index was because that's when the first FMP was initiated. Okay, this table shows the number of indices within a region where the terminal year of the index was below an index-based reference point, both for the probability of being below the 1998 index point and also the 25th percentile. And what we saw, this compares the 2013 update to the 2009 stock assessment. And in the southeast region and in the Delaware Bay region, things seem to be either increasing or at least holding steady in those regions. However, in New York and New England, we see, again, a continued decline. And we went from 1 out of 5 surveys to 3 out of 5 surveys, for example, in New York, now being below the 1998 index-based reference point. Likewise, in New England, things also appeared to be getting worse. So this caused the management board to charge the TC and Stock Assessment Subcommittee with further examination of trends in New York and New England regions. And this was to include the use of, or include biomedical mortality from these regions. The question is, could that be a possible reason why we see continued declines in New York and New England? However, by using and trying to use biomedical data to assess mortality from that industry, we run into data confidentiality issues. Within the New York and New England region, there's only one biomedical company harvesting and bleeding crabs, and that's the Associates of Cape Cod. So what we did get permission to use some of that biomedical data and to help examine the trends in New York and New England a little more closely. So we looked at the survey indices from New York and New England. In New England, we had 8 surveys, fishery independent surveys. In New York, 6 different indices. And these were then combined to develop a composite index of New York and New England indices with linear mixed effects models. Within these models, the random effect in these models was each survey. So each survey was allowed to fluctuate on its independently of the other surveys. And then before running this model, we scaled the surveys so that their values were within the same order of magnitude. Basically just moved a decimal point on the yearly index from each survey. For the bait harvest then, for New England, this was ASMFC reported landings from Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and likewise from New York, it was landings from Connecticut and New York. For the biomedical harvest, as I said, we obtained data from Associates of Cape Cod, and the kill from the biomedical industry equaled the released horseshoe crabs after bleeding, multiplied by the TC adopted assumed mortality rate of 15% mortality on bled crabs, plus any dead crabs that suffered mortality prior to the bleeding. We did not include any horseshoe crabs that ultimately went into the bait industry, so there was no double counting in our assessment of biomedical harvest. And from these data, then, given the biomedical harvest, the bait harvest, and our composite index of abundance, we calculated an index of relative F. So the relative F for the bait industry was just the bait harvest divided by the composite index for a given year, and then the relative F for the biomedical industry was the biomedical kill divided by the composite index in a given year. Okay, and this graph just shows the bait harvest that's reported to ASMFC and how it's changed through time since 1998. You can see after 2000, both New York and New England bait harvest has greatly decreased and has bounced around at a much lower level over the past decade. And here we have the composite indices for New York and New England. And we went back to 1990. There were a few surveys in the New England region that went farther back in time than 1990, but we, for this analysis, just cut it off at 1990 and to the present. And as you can see in the New England region, we see a big decline from about 1995 onward, and the index has bounced around at low levels since the early 2000s. In the New York region, the index bounced around early in the time series and shows more variability than the New England index. But since about 1996, there's a general decline downward in the New York region. So for the relative F, again, this was just the bait and biomedical harvest divided by that composite index in each year. For New England, the bait industry has fluctuated through time. It's gone up and down. It was decreasing until about 2011, and then in 2012 went back up. For the New England biomedical relative F, it shows a fairly similar pattern to that of the bait industry, with that peak there in about 2008, followed by a decline, and then an increase again in 2012. Now, one thing you'll note on the bottom graph for the New England biomedical relative F, I've left the y-axis labels off just because of those data confidentiality issues. So at minimum we can say from this is that the biomedical relative F seems to be tracking or showing the same similar trend up and down as the New England bait relative F. In the New York region, the relative F for the bait industry decreased in the early 2000s, which would be expected because of the big harvest decline, but then has generally shown a bit of an upward trend since the early 2000s. In the New York region, there is none of the crabs that are bled from the Associates of Cape Cod came from the New York region, or at least what we're calling the New York region, so the relative F the relative F for the biomedical industry in New York was essentially zero across the time series. So some conclusions from this further analysis of New York and New England. The composite indices show declining trends, which, this was a new analysis that we didn't have in the stock assessment update, but it's nice to see that it also agrees with the 2013 stock assessment update that those regions are continuing to decline. Bait harvest was reduced in both regions after 2000, and trends in relative F for the New England region are similar between the bait harvest and biomedical mortality. Bait relative F shows some upward trend after 2003 in the New York region. And there was no biomedical harvest from the New York region. However, we still have quite a few questions that remain in our assessment of horseshoe crabs. First, how does the biomedical mortality in the New England region compare to the bait mortality? Like I said, I had to leave the scale on that y-axis off because of those data confidentiality issues, and so it's hard to really get a feeling for how the two compare. Is total mortality, bait plus biomedical, still too high to allow population growth in both of those regions? Should the bait and/or biomedical take be reduced in those regions? And the big question is, how does assessment of horseshoe crabs advance given the data confidentiality issues? Coastwide biomedical mortality in 2012 was estimated at 10% of the total harvest of all horseshoe crabs, with the bait and biomedical industries combined. And we're in a situation where there's not a whole lot more we can do in horseshoe crab assessment without having access to biomedical data. In our 2013 update, one of the things, or our 2009 stock assessment for the Delaware Bay region, was the first year that we could start to do a catch survey model to get some better benchmarks and better estimates of horseshoe crab mortality in that area. However, we didn't include that in the 2013 update, and the reason why we didn't include it is because we realized the estimated biomedical harvest was approaching a point to where it wasn't negligible anymore. So therefore, since we couldn't include the biomedical harvest for the Delaware Bay region, we didn't run that catch survey model again. So it's not just, the confidentiality issue is not just an issue for New York and New England to try to figure out what's going on in those regions. It has implications for coastwide assessment of horseshoe crabs. Thank you.
Thanks. Questions, Pat?
Yeah, great report. Great report. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so the questions that are, can I have that one back? The last chart up there with your conclusions on it, please. Okay, so let's go to the second point. Is total mortality, bait and biomedical, still too high to allow the population growth in both regions? The question is, does the technical committee see a trend as to how we can improve it? And if you can't see a trend and we continue to see it go down without the confidentiality information being made available, it forces one to come to the conclusion we have to reduce them both. Now that's a leap of faith, but that's based on the fact we don't have adequate information. And the next line, should bait and tackle biomedical take be reduced in those regions? And the answer would be yes. Unless you could answer those questions without more adequate information, I would wait to hear other questions around the table. But boy, it raises a real big red flag. Say, if you can't get the information, and we can't determine it's one or the other, then we have to reduce them both. We have a high level of poaching in the state of New York, and I don't want to get off the main subject. And Jim's staff is attacking that, but it's still very high. And you've seen the reports, and our trend is continuing down because of the value of those animals. So if you're going to address those questions, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a very difficult one. We know what the bait is because that's reported, and we still have this declining trend. In the New York region, given that there was, at least from Associates Cape Cod, there are no horseshoe crabs harvested for the biomedical industry from the New York region, all the mortality is associated with the bait industry. But in the New England region, because of that confidentiality issue, it's hard to tease apart. We can't say the relative effects of each.
Okay, thanks. I had a quick question or two, and then I need to get to Mike. Did you report? I missed it if you did. The harvest in comparison to the quota for each state. What proportion of the quota are we taking?
I didn't report that in this presentation. It's something we could easily look up. I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay, because that would seem to be a starting point if we're allocating, if our quota is set too high to achieve rebuilding, then that's probably where we want to start is to address it through that approach. Yeah, Maureen?
Just off the top of my head, I don't think any of the states are that near to their quota, but I can easily look on my computer and let you know.
Okay. And The other observation I made from your presentation was that the relative F value was pretty volatile for the New England region, and for relative F, that seemed a little bit surprising. I wondered if you felt that was more due to the variability in the survey indices or in the harvest removal side of the equation.
I'd say it was both. Probably more the survey indice than the harvest. From that graph, the graph of the survey index went back to 2000 or to 1990, but our relative F calculations were only from 2004 onward. So you don't, and because of that big reduction in the composite index, you don't see there's still quite a bit of fluctuation that you don't really notice just because of the scale of that graph.
Great, thanks. Mike, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Pat touched on most of my issues, but I guess I do have a question for John, a fairly simple question, but I'd like to get it on the record. That from the TC standpoint, were we not bumping up against this confidentiality issue? Do you feel that we would, in fact, have a better management, or we could move forward and manage the harvest better in a more efficient or effective way?
I would say yes, at least from a more transparent perspective. Like I said, the biomedical harvest coast-wide has gotten to the point where we can't ignore it any longer. It's upwards of 10%, and it's shown an increasing trend through time. So we have to take, in order to do scientific management of horseshoe crab, we have to be able to account for that in any stock assessment models that we'd like to run into the future. For example, the kit survey model in the Delaware Bay, we didn't run it in the 2013 update because we knew we're missing a good portion of the total kill of horseshoe crabs. In the New York, New England region, our data isn't quite as good as what it is in the Delaware Bay, but there's some other methods that we'd like to be able to run, but we still don't have that full harvest or full fishery mortality component to include.
Thanks. And yeah, I'll just observe that data confidentiality is something that we live with in every state and at the Commission because the data are protected. I've run into this issue trying to examine alternative management strategies for lobster, for example, and we couldn't look at landings by state and month because the data might be confidential. I think one of the particular aspects of horseshoe crabs is that we have reported time series of bait landings and then a more recent introduction of this biomedical component. So even reporting the landings in a composite fashion, by simple subtraction from old documents, you could determine what someone's individual level of participation in the fishery, will say, was. And so that would violate our confidentiality rules, both at the Commission and certainly if it were happening in Connecticut, I couldn't release the data by state law. Other comments, questions? Tom?
I know that the next agenda item is on biomedical and confidentiality, but just in observations for a number of years now, we've kind of seen this decreasing trend in the New York region, at least, and wondering, does the technical committee have some suggestions on what action should be needed? We know that this species is long-lived, late-maturing, low fecundity. The longer we wait, if it gets to a serious situation, it's going to be a long time to try to get that population to recover. So, kind of curious: are we looking for the next steps? Do we need to charge a TC with coming back and giving us some recommendations? Or are they looking for some guidance from us? What are you looking for today? I guess my question is.
Do you want to provide
Penny's actually the TC chair, but I guess on her behalf, I would say the TC would probably be just looking for some guidance on how to proceed, from here on out. I know at least from a stock assessment subcommittee perspective, that's what we're looking for. What more can we do?
And the greater decline was in the New York region, wasn't it?
The greatest decline is in the New England region, but New York is also trending downwards.
Okay. So, yeah, I think, okay, great. So yeah, I think we are probably looking to provide the technical committee and the stock assessment committee with some guidance on what we'd like to see so that we can make decisions about our quota management system. Having said that, I think Marin has some details now on how our harvest has compared to the quota in the last year or in recent years.
Yeah, so Kate is hopefully going to help me here and put up just a very quickly put together graph of the quota in Massachusetts and New York, because those are the two states with the highest bait landings, versus their bait landings since 1998. So as you'll see soon, and keep in mind, both of these states have elected to have a quota that's lower than that the Commission put forth for them. So for Massachusetts, their Commission quota is 330,377 crabs, and they've chosen to implement a quota of 165,000 crabs. And for New York, their quota is 366,272 crabs, and they've chosen to implement a quota of 150,000 crabs. So these quotas that are on this graph are the state-chosen quotas. So they're about 200,000 crabs below what the Commission plan indicates these states should have. So if you... And again, I put this together very quickly. So the Massachusetts is the blue line, and the Massachusetts quota is the green line. And so this graph kind of indicates that it's pretty much below that quota. And New York is a little bit closer to New York's quota, but still not really going over it. And again, they're very far below the FMP quotas for both of these states.
Okay, thanks, Marin. Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Marin. That was some of the things I was going to bring up, and I want to make sure John's got a notation on his harvest chart that, we had voluntarily dropped our quota, so some of those harvest drops you see were just from a voluntary harvest reduction. And we've had a great deal of difficulty, even managing that because of, a couple of things. It's that, we did have a much higher harvest. And actually, we're concerned now because we're about to put regulations in limiting Asian horseshoe crabs to prevent them. And the first thing we got back from our fishermen was that, well, you need to increase the quota on back to 360, which we're reluctant to do because we've been watching this and we're concerned about it. And I don't know what all the reasons are, but one of them, and I'll put this out, and maybe following Tom O'Connell's idea before about maybe something the TC could look at. Part of this is because of the moratorium to the west of us. We really have a poaching problem, and it's driven the price up. And, we can't keep up with it. I mean, harvesting horseshoe crabs, you need a pickup truck and a freezer, and it's not really difficult to get into this fishery, and it's very difficult for our law enforcement guys to really stay on top of it. So, and I know, Jersey's had their issues in terms, and I understand what they're doing, but it really gets down to that fisheries management 101. It's like putting a moratorium on a healthy stock is a bad idea, and I think we're starting to see that. So is there any way that we could maybe from a technical standpoint evaluate that this moratorium could really be having part of the problem of the overharvest, and it's actually backfiring. If you're doing a moratorium to the west, it's actually increasing price to the east, and that's causing more harvest, and you're having now an effect on the population. So if there's anything to be done on that, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks. Dan?
Thank you. We've done a number of things in Massachusetts that keep our landings constrained. We adopted, similar to Rhode Island, the lunar closures, so we don't allow any harvest in the spring during the 5 days around the new and full moon. We're in the process of reducing the mobile gear limits down to 300 crabs a day, which is mostly a Nantucket Sound fishery. So we've been aggressive, but I mean, by and large, these are localized stocks, and we have horseshoe crabs in Barnstable Harbor, in Wellfleet Harbor. These are areas north of Cape Cod that have no relationship to those that are off Nantucket. So, we talk about a regional decline, but these are really localized stocks. So it really falls upon us to manage this not at the local level, but more or less on the local scene, because it is not a locally managed species in Massachusetts. It is something under our purview. I did want to point out that the early years that keep being shown, and I brought this up at the last meeting, that 1998-2000 time series that data is bogus. I mean, the information that was brought forward was back of the envelope calculations. It was not based on any signed catch reports by individual fishermen. So I hope that going forward we more focus on the 2002 onward trends, because that's when we really had valid catch reports. As far as poaching goes, Pat mentions poaching. Maybe it would be useful to ask the Law Enforcement Committee to address this, or at least describe what efforts each of the state's agencies has done. I don't think my state's law enforcement group has made this a priority, because just frankly it hasn't been. So maybe that would be a worthwhile effort for the Law Enforcement Committee to bring forward some report as to how much effort they put into that and recommendations to how to improve that. But my last comment in response to Jim, 2 meetings ago we started talking about this whelk fishery that is proliferating, but most of us around the table don't have an aggressive effort control plan on the whelk pots, and that's where most of the demand is. So it makes sense, if we're trying to control the harvest of horseshoe crabs, to try to look at the demand for this bait. And I think that some of the rules or the lack of rules governing or allowing the growth in the whelk pot fishery is somewhat irresponsible, and is probably going to collapse those stocks. So maybe we don't have that far to go before the stocks have collapsed. And then the last point is, I know Delaware has been working really hard, and some of the manufacturers, to come up with a substitute bait. Maybe we all ought to consider requiring either the pucks, the artificial bait, or put some limits on how much horseshoe crab you can put into a pot. Granted, it's not an easy thing to regulate, but neither is a lot of the other rules we have. But I think there's a whole lot of issues here that we should be taking up, and I think on the demand side, that's probably something we should address, because I don't think horseshoe crabs are going to last, and of course the ex-vessel price is going up so high, it is constraining. So those are my comments.
Thanks, Dan. And I think it is a good suggestion that we get some feedback from the Law Enforcement Committee, what they're seeing and how high a priority it is, and what their issues are, because as we know, with every FMP, it's only as good as the enforcement that's applied, and that's an important component not to be overlooked. Pat, you had another comment?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a good conversation. I'm glad you brought that up, Dan. Do you recall back in Philadelphia, I guess it was 3 or 4 years ago, when we talked about what the other options were that fishermen could do, and there were bait bags made available. That was the pitch, to reduce the usage of horseshoe crabs. Instead of using the whole horseshoe crab, cut it in half or quarter it, and we still have guys doing that. But then there was also a bait on the market that was being developed, a piece of leather or some sort that seemed to last pretty well. Don't hear any more about that. And it just seems as though those initiatives kind of fallen by the wayside, or maybe they're being used and we don't know it. But it would seem to me we should bring some more attention back to that. And again, we can't let that slip in the crack. Thank you.
The TC, if you recall, I think it was back in the August meeting, we discussed the artificial bait from that study in Delaware. So the TC has kind of been pursuing that to determine whether it's cost effective. So we are pursuing that.
Thanks. Other comments, Tom?
Yeah, maybe just try to move us along here is, and maybe mostly for New York and New England, but the entire board. Given what we've seen for a while now, does anyone feel like we should just not be doing anything? And if people have that opinion, I'd like to hear it. Otherwise, I think we need to figure out an approach to further evaluate some of the ideas that were put on the table and come back and to look at those ideas more thoroughly.
Yeah, I agree, Tom. Thanks. I think one of the things is that my recollection of the history of this plan and adoption of quotas was we were taking our best guess, to Dan's point, of what the landings were, and set a quota based on that. So it wasn't a really rigorous process that we went through to set those quotas, and maybe in retrospect they were set too high. So I think the fundamentals are, right now we're not hitting, our management would say we have no problem in overall harvest because we're staying under the quota. Maybe it's time to do a little bit of work to identify a more appropriate harvest cap and then restructure our management to that. So being a board chair, I can't make any motions, but Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly do feel that we do need to move forward and respond to what we've been hearing, both at this meeting, and thank you for the technical report just provided, as well at the prior meeting, and I remember now, having just looked back on the minutes, as to what sort of prompted this report from the technical committee, and that was the sense that, that the assessment, having just been duly adopted at the last meeting, spoke, in very specific and substantive ways to the status of the stock down south, and only more vaguely spoke to the issues in the New England, New York area, and that prompted me to request the technical committee to report back on the issues of characterizing data collection, monitoring, and assessment work needed to address the population declines in the two regions. So what I'm trying to figure out now is, are we still at the stage of trying to figure out what additional data and monitoring do we need to do to enable us to take the appropriate management actions, or do we have what we need? Is it as good as it's going to get, and are we now at the point where we should start to develop some management options? It's either one or the other or both, but I do feel like we do need to move forward given what we've been hearing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we could always use more data. All the surveys that we have from the New England region, none of them are specific to horseshoe crabs. They're the numbers that we get for crabs in those indices. They come from surveys that are targeted for other species. It would be nice to have horseshoe crab specific surveys. It would also be nice to have more biological data, sex ratios on, from within those surveys. Perhaps that data does exist, in the raw data when it's actually collected, but it hasn't come forward to the TC and the Stock Assessment Subcommittee. Ultimately, in the Delaware Bay region, with the Virginia Tech Trawl Survey, we are headed towards the use of a catch survey model, where we had information by sex and also by primiparous and multiparous maturity of crabs. So it would be nice to have that information. But at the same time, the other thing, with what we have now, we could do some simpler sorts of stock assessment models if we also had and could freely disseminate the biomedical harvest in that too. One method that I've had in mind for a while is to use within the Northeast Fisheries Center toolbox. It's called an index method. It's a relative F method that will set allows you to come up with some benchmark relative F values, and then you can manage according to those. But even something as simple as that, we currently can't do.
Okay, so at this point, as I understand it, you have the technical committee and the stock assessment committee has been given access to all the data that we have, removals, including biomedical estimates. So you do have all that data, and it's a matter of how you conduct the assessment, report the results, and still retain the required confidentiality.
Yes.
So, Roy?
The comment I have, Mr. Chairman, is not directly related to your discussion, if you want to come back to me, but it is in regard to horseshoe crabs, of course.
Okay, well, I think along the lines of what we need to do, you're on a path of doing an assessment. I think we need to do that, and hopefully the outcome of that ultimately will be a basis for evaluating our current quotas and what levels are appropriate. And if we can't do that, then maybe as a board we need to think about a different kind of approach to management other than quotas. And again, as I said, in that process, find a way to maintain the confidentiality we're required to maintain.
Yeah, I would just say that right now, I don't, given the confidentiality issue right now, I don't see us being able to do anything better than the simple trend analysis that we've done. Because, like I said, coast-wide, we've acknowledged that the biomedical kill isn't negligible anymore. And without incorporating that into any, real assessment, I don't know that we can get any farther than our simple trend analyses that we've been doing.
Jim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your suggestion on the law enforcement committee, is that something we would need? Can you just include that, or do we have to do a motion? I think that's a good idea to essentially have them take a look at this, because, again, may not be the entire problem, but I'm sure it's, a good part of it. So if they could, for the May meeting, put together an evaluation of their efforts and their take on this, I think it would be helpful.
Okay, thanks. No, I kind of just made eye contact with Bob, and he sort of nodded at me that that's a done deal when we were talking about it, so I think we'll get that. And for law enforcement, doing it. Okay, yeah, we're getting the nod that that's a done deal. Yeah, we'll, having come up against this confidentiality issue a few times, I think we do need to, the technical people do have access to the data, and I think can do work, and I would think, Bob, we could retain the confidentiality if we were to get that report back. Hey, Bob? Trying to run a concept by you of getting an assessment done from the technical folks and reviewing it internally first, perhaps with myself and Marin and yourself, Tony, internally for those results and how we can package those results to balance the need for full disclosure for peer review purposes, but also retain confidentiality, and then maybe find a path there to move it out to the more public arena for the board and the general public.
Is that on the two parts of that? One, are you requesting that the assessment schedule be increased? I think it's on 2016 now. Is that what it is, John? So are you saying when that is finished, sort of internal group look at the results, or something different?
No, within its own time frame, scheduled time frame. Let's do this work, share the results within the group to retain the confidentiality, and try to figure out a report out process that finds the balance between the competing needs for openness and retaining confidentiality. And that we would do that as a group, 5 of us perhaps, to do that and develop a publicly accessible document.
I think that's fine. I mean, if we have data confidentiality clearance, we can look at the data, and then we can ensure that it's packaged in a way that doesn't violate any of those provisions. And we're going to have a discussion here in a little bit with the industry on those provisions, and depending on what those results look like, maybe there's an opportunity to work with the industry on the packaging of moving forward. I mean, maybe there's a comfort level of exposing more trends and different things to the general public rather than specific numbers, and so we might be able to have a little bit more description without. With the approval of the industry, we might be able to be a little bit more descriptive than we are under the current provisions, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Does that sound like a workable way forward for the group? Okay. What's that?
Can we clarify that this is just for the New York and New England region still?
Yeah, I think that's what we're talking about right now. And if there's nothing else on the stock trends, Bob?
I'm sorry. Thank you. A clarification on the time frames, because I heard 2016 for the next assessment, but then I'm not sure that we're talking about waiting until 2016 with this. So could you just clarify what we're looking at in terms of rollout of the process that you just described?
Well, I wasn't suggesting changing the work plans that we've already laid out, for the various stock assessments. So within that schedule, when we get to it, we want to see that work done on the schedule, and then we'll work to make sure that we balance the need for confidentiality and sufficient output results to base management on.
I just would express concern that means we're looking at a 2+ year time frame, if I'm correct. I see different responses from Maren and you. So I'm trying to get a handle on whether we can do anything or should be doing anything sooner rather than later with regard to the New England and New York trend decline issue.
I think we can continue to pursue investigating the New England and New York regions using this method, in the upcoming year. So it wouldn't be a coast-wide assessment or a benchmark assessment by any means. It's just investigating trends further.
Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard John say that the biomedical was about 10% and has been growing. Is that relative to changes in quotas for the bait as well, or is that just relative to the way quotas are now? Because we also heard a couple of states have taken lower quotas. So where does that start, that trend for the biomedical? And then another thing is there are bait quotas, and there doesn't seem to be biomedical caps by region. So, one thing to think about, not very popular I'm sure, but one thing to think about is there's a cap for a region. Does that help the analysis to go beyond what you can do now? Because if you assume that the cap is being taken, then you use that value, and it's a conservative value. Does that move anything forward as far as you can see?
Well, the first question about where the 10% came from, the 10% estimate for 2012 was just the estimated biomedical kill, assuming the number of crabs coastwide that were bled, assuming a 15% mortality on those, and then dividing that by the total kill from the biomedical plus whatever was killed in the bait industry. So that changing percentage, if the bait industry is declining, that is one thing that could make that percentage increase. At the same time, though, just the absolute numbers of bled crabs has gone up through time as well. The second question with, if we just assume, well, there isn't a quota for the biomedical industry coastwide. In the original FMP, there was a 57,000 coastwide recommendation, and if that was exceeded, it was stipulated in the plan that the board may consider taking action. That's been exceeded for a number of years now. Now, if, from an assessment standpoint, if we just assumed, if the board developed regional quotas, and then we just assumed that the biomedical industry hit those quotas, personally, I would say that that's not very informative. That's not real scientific data, to use in any sort of assessment model.
Yeah, I think more fundamentally than whether a subcomponent of the fishery hit really an arbitrary cap that we set on them, more fundamentally, it sounds like the initial quotas that we set may not have been adequate to achieve the conservation you need for stock rebuilding. So I think we have a more fundamental problem of taking a closer look at what are sustainable harvests that would allow for the stock to grow to more healthy levels. I think we've pretty well transitioned into a discussion of the biomedical mortality and confidentiality, and Marin has a little bit on that, and we have a couple of people here that want to speak to that.
That happens every meeting. All right. Yeah, so this is the biomedical working group report. As If you'll recall, back in October 2013, when we first discussed this, the board put together a working group because they were concerned with the increase in the number of dead crabs, which are attributed to the biomedical sector, and also the lack of ability to use these data in the stock assessment, as John's discussed. So the board formed this working group to facilitate the discussions. And it consisted of representatives from each of the biomedical companies, as well as the board members from each state with a biomedical company. So that was Massachusetts, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, and South Carolina. And this working group held a conference call in December to provide solutions and recommendations to the board. So the topics of discussion were the confidentiality of data and the increased mortality in the biomedical sector. And these are two separate issues. The confidentiality of data deals with the fact that we would like to look at the data by region, and there's less than if there are less than 3 biomedical companies in a region, it prevents that data from being included in the assessment. And the increased mortality is perhaps partially due to an increased harvest, but it's not an increased mortality rate. I just wanted to make that very clear. The rate of mortality in the biomedical sector has stayed consistent, and it's just that now it's a larger part of the coast-wide mortality. So it used to be about 2% of the coast-wide mortality. Now it's up to about 10% of the coast-wide mortality. So we first discussed the confidentiality of the biomedical data, and as I just mentioned, horseshoe crabs are assessed by region. There's the New England region, the New York region, the Delaware Bay region, and the Southeast region. And it's the lack of the confidentiality of these data prevents it from being used in the assessments. And due to the increased contribution to the coast-wide mortality, the Stock Assessment Subcommittee feels that excluding the biomedical data, harvest and mortality does not provide an accurate assessment, as John's discussed. So we came up with 2 possible solutions. The first was to release all the biomedical data to the public, and the second was to release the biomedical data to the Stock Assessment Subcommittee, but require that it remain confidential. And so the pros and cons, I'm just going to outline the pros and cons of each. The first is to release the data to the public, and the benefits of that would be that the data are available to the Stock Assessment Subcommittee and would be included in the assessment, and the data would be published in the report, which promotes transparency. However, the cons of this is that it could expose the data for misuse by interest groups, and there are also some potential business issues since the production could be determined among the different biomedical companies, and the biomedical representatives strongly oppose this option. The second is to release the data to the Stock Assessment Subcommittee, but the data would remain confidential. The benefit of this would be the data would be available to be included in the stock assessment, but it also avoid potential business complications from releasing those records. But the cons would be it's unclear how useful this information would be for management, and it clouds the transparency of the stock assessment process because the public would not understand how the stock status was obtained. And the Stock Assessment Subcommittee and the Technical Committee strongly oppose this option. So I thought we might want to pause and discuss this first issue before moving on to the increase in biomedical mortality.
Any comments on this, Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I had and I'm going to be very bold, and you may be very upset with me about what I'm ready to say, but if I had a monopoly on something, I wouldn't want anybody to know what I was doing either. Questions about confidentiality. Now, we're managing a horseshoe crab that has many, many values, and this biomedical value is absolutely essential. I'm alive because of it. I also look at the status of the stock. So the question is, are we, the state's, going to limit any use for horseshoe crabs other than biomedical? And if that's true, let's assume we will, then can we only assume that ASMFC will manage horseshoe crabs for the benefit of the biomedical industry only, and there will be no other purpose? So, and if there's no limit on how expansive the biomedical industry can be or get, what's to keep them, or what's to prevent them from wiping out the status of the stock completely and put us in a depleted state? So we're talking about a series of possible things that could happen. The real question here is, who are we protecting the animals for? And should a particular group or any individual group have total use of that animal? And so somewhere along the line in your report, you did say that they prefer not to have this information made available. I thought the way you presented it, or we presented it, was the data would be confidential within the staff and be totally self-contained, to be combined together to show the board and have our stock assessment folks know what that total number was, so we can make some better decisions as to what we're going to do. So I just made some hard statements, and I'm not sure you can respond to those, but taking the approach they're taking, it doesn't give us as managers much of a choice, does it, Mr. Chairman?
Well, Marin has some comments, but first I think the concerns about a complete flip-flop and who's, approaching near exclusive use of the resource, I think, we're a long way from that. And in terms of confidentiality, I agree. I believe 100% that a public resource, the information should be publicly available. My income, the income of every state employee in Connecticut and every retired individual, that information is public knowledge. But the law on fisheries says it's confidential. And the commission policy is it's confidential. So what I believe in this case doesn't really matter. The law is different than we would like it to be. The only way you're going to. So we need to respect that aspect of our plans. And I wish I marked it. Preparing for the meeting, there was at least one table where I think it was state-by-state landings on another species. Every state was reported except for one, and that could not be provided because it was confidential. Now, that could have been 100 times what everyone else landed, I don't know. But that is the world that we live in. We have to, so those are the constraints that we have to work in. Dan?
I'm not sure that the problem is as bad as it's perceived, because these are really localized stocks, and I don't think we're going to wipe out the southern New England East Coast stock of horseshoe crabs with rules or without rules. So I just don't see it. And furthermore, the biomedical firms have a bleed and release policy, so obviously there's no way they're going to wipe out the stocks, because presumably for every 100 animals they bleed, 85 are going to live. So I don't see it. But Pat makes some good points, but I don't think it's that drastic. I really think that we all have to go home and manage these things, based on our local knowledge. That's a much bigger challenge, and we all know what our fisheries need, but we also know the uniqueness of these embayments. And a lot of the biomedical crabs in Massachusetts are coming from a single embayment that wouldn't be detected through trawl surveys. It's one that's east of the Cape and Pleasant Bay. We've made it biomedical only. So that particular industry is going to affect that embayment, and we haven't seen any crashes of that stock in that little embayment.
Just to address, I think Pat was kind of suggesting that if you release that we could get a little bit further by investigating what's happening in the stock if you release the data to the stock assessment subcommittee, but have it remain confidential. But I just wanted to clarify that's what we've done with the New England, New York, and so this is what we've gotten from that.
Stu, and then Rob.
Thanks. Marin, I'm pretty naive on this stuff. Can you try and help me understand how it is a competitive advantage to protect the number of crabs that you harvest for biomedical purposes?
I'm going to turn to the industry, and perhaps someone would like to help me answer that.
Does someone here from the industry want to take a stab at explaining that? Basically, I've heard it in our work group that knowing the number of crabs tells you the size of your business, reveals the size of your business, and that's something that they feel is important to preserve what market share they have. This isn't one fisherman in 10,000 this is one of a few companies in the world. So by quick subtraction and by the math of how many crabs, you know what your competitor is doing. So that's one of their business concerns. And I think this might be a good time. We had a couple people from the industry who want to make some comments. I think I'll go to them now, and that may help us a lot understand this business and this fishery. So. Okay, Jim, do you have, want to take the public mic?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a disclaimer, Dr. Jim Cooper. As a disclaimer, I'm usually here representing the advisory panel for the horseshoe crab, but actually I'm here to give my own statement since I haven't gotten their approval or we haven't formally met for this purpose, although I've discussed this matter with them. So I'm just here to provide hopefully some information that will help you understand the situation here. I do think the confidentiality issue has been overstated. And we've also then had some other comments, particularly from Massachusetts, that have put our considerations, I think, more into balance and perspective. Realize that from the very start, the biomedical community has been in the business of conserving horseshoe crabs. This started in 1973. Now, it is true that I founded one of the companies. I have retired now, so I really can't speak for management, but I began this process in 69 and 70. It makes me look old, but actually I was only 7 years old at the time, so of course that's not the case. But, from the start, we've been had the return to sea policy, and secondly, we've educated the public and watermen as to the value of the horseshoe crab. It used to be treated as a nuisance and was destroyed. And, of course, when we started the FMP, initiated in 1998, the FMP continued to recognize the fact that there would be a return to sea policy. By the way, we have the fellow who led us on that FMP sitting over here, Tom McConnell. That was 15 years ago that we got the FMP through. And Tom was able to manage this two ways. First of all, he provided good leadership, and secondly, just as we convened for the meeting, he called in a 20-inch snowstorm, and we were confined to the hotel until we finished the FMP, and then finally the snow melted. So yes, we did get it through. And this 57K mark that was written into this was not written to be a level where it was thought to be a threshold where there would be damage, should that be considered, or not to be a level that would be punitive. If you exceeded that, it would be punitive. At that level, we were supposed to reevaluate the possibilities, as was discussed over here a few minutes ago. And the response has been to that is that a few years ago I suggested that we could come up with some best management plans, BMP, where the biomedical community could get together, communicate, along with our state agencies that regulate us, and come up with good management practices to see so that we could do all we could do to minimize the mortality in conducting our business. As you can well imagine, we're not going to have a zero mortality in conducting this business. Even the 15% mark that we think represents what happens to crabs once they come into our possession, this is not on really hard evidence. You see, it's very difficult to create an environment for the horseshoe crab and treat it as a laboratory animal. You know, you can do this with mice and rats and things like that, but this is a very difficult creature to manage in a laboratory or experimental evaluation setting. So, you know, this is not a hard number. And I think I would like for you guys to ask yourself this question is that is the LAL industry and the valuable product that we make available to the healthcare system, is it worth, let's say, 75,000 crabs sacrificed in the process of doing this business? 75,000 crabs. That's roughly 15% of what is being collected these days. Is it, you know, I think we're making a valuable product. If you want the answer to that, don't ask me or just yourselves. Ask physicians and surgeons, folks in the in the healthcare system. Ask the pharmaceutical industry as they're making these drug products. You know, what is the value of that? Let's say that the number is 75,000 a year. And Carl Schuster, of course, is here today, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier. How many horseshoe crabs are there out there on the Atlantic floor? Probably 50 million. Okay, so if we're taking 75,000 out of 50 million, isn't that about 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000? So isn't that a valuable use of the resource to produce this reagent? So I'd like for you all to think about that and keep all this in perspective. So in response to exceeding the so-called threshold, I think let's realize that this threshold has sort of outgrown its usefulness. And I'd like to see you replace that with what we're already doing in the biomedical industry. And that's we adopted something that I would borrow from the radiation industry of the ALARA concept, which is we would keep the mortality as low as reasonably achievable and not be worried about caps or worried about limits. Our goal is just to keep that number as low as possible. How do you do that? Well, in our industry, it means that we have, because we're in the highly regulated drug industry, we have a lot of written procedures all throughout the industry. And we have written procedures that are dedicated to the handling of horseshoe crab specimen. We have procedures for how they would handle, how they'd be transported, have procedures for training the people that bring them to them, to try to make sure that they take the same care in bringing them to the facility and use the same care in taking them back to the ocean. Come up with practices where we try to not just dump them on a beach, but put them back into fast-moving waters where they can just spread out and begin to forage and live their normal life. So, also want you to appreciate the fact that this the mortality in the horseshoe crab industry, it doesn't come from the bleeding. Okay. When the creatures come in, they're handled carefully, and only those that are very, very vigorous and show no signs of injury or illness, those are the only ones that go to the further on in the process. And when they come out, they have the same kind of vigor associated with that. They're not like humans that often faint when they're being bled. You know, there still is, we can tell that there's nothing wrong with them. What are the ones that die? Well, as you can imagine, we capture a lot of creatures because they can't be culled. We're being captured at night. We can't sort them out at that point in time. We catch a lot of creatures that are injured, are ill, are near the end of their lifespan. there, and with the stress of the capture and so forth, we're going to lose some creatures, but that's what becomes the mortality. It's not the bleeding itself. In fact, Carl Schuster told me one time that 10% of the females that come on the beach at the spawning time will not make it back, either stranding or whatever. So yes, there's not zero mortality during spawning or collecting for the horseshoe crab industry. And we haven't even gotten to some of those other things that cause sharp mortality. If you look at the riprap over on the many Delaware beaches, and you see thousands of crabs trapped that come in with the high tide and can't get back out. So you have that issue. You have the poaching issue, and some of the estimates are that may be equal to the amounts that are being reported in harvest to the states. And just last meeting, again, you were introduced to the artificial bait. And can you just think how this discussion would change 2 years from now if indeed the scientific study showed that the efficacy study, tough word, showed that there was no significant difference between horseshoe crab bait and that from the artificial bait. Wow, that needs to be followed up on. Can you imagine what a difference that would make here? Potentially greatly reducing the harvest because of an effective artificial bait. So I would like for you to accept the fact that our current mortality number, I don't want to mention rate because we don't know what that is, but the total mortality, hope you would feel that this is a good use of the resource, and it's an acceptable one, and it's time to put away the 57K as a monitor. We will, by the way, the horseshoe crab collection is about 600,000 right now, and I really see nothing that would drive that up. And as Marion has pointed out, that seems to be leveled off at about that point. Of course, and like I say, there's nothing on the horizon that would lead me to think that there would be a change at that. So I would hope that you would realize that we're going to continue doing the Alara concept, so to speak, doing our best to keep those numbers low. And there is a way for you to get an answer to how well we're doing. You can ask the representative state agency, and you can try to get answers to two questions. One, do they have written procedures in place that guide them toward low mortality? And secondly, are they following those procedures? The state agencies know what's going on in these laboratories. They're a part of it. They're part of the team because they both have a vested interest. So thank you very much.
I appreciate your input, Dr. Cooper. I think it was very helpful. Stu?
Yeah, is it all right to go ahead and ask a question of Dr. Cooper? Do you have time for a question?
Sure, go ahead.
You made mention of the alternative bait. Isn't there an alternative to LAL? And where are we in that process?
There is a recombinant factor C, which means this is a recombinant non-horseshoe crab source. In the industry, it is not the same. Let's call it maybe the recombinant product doesn't behave the same way. And one of the problems is that the FDA does not license it so that users in the pharmaceutical industry, which are really heavily handed when it comes to regulations, are reluctant to go forward and use the recombinant product because it's not regulated to the fact in the same way that LAL is regulated. And I really don't want to say much more on that because I don't know a great deal about the recombinant product. but it has not made much headway into the industry. As far as I'm concerned, for testing certain simple materials, I don't know why it wouldn't be as good as the LAL, but the industry, for their own reasons, has not elected to make that a great part of their usefulness. So, in terms of artificial approaches, your artificial bait might be the best chance at this point. But, by the way, Alan Bergenson is here, and he is with the company that makes the recombinant product, and he could give you, I think, perhaps a fair explanation about the status of the recombinant product in the industry. But you remember, the pharmaceuticals are so heavily regulated, they're not going to make changes easily.
Okay, thanks. I think, Mike, okay, one more question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was a question and a comment. I thank Dr. Cooper for that report. I would like to make clear, though, that I don't think anyone around this table is questioning the value of your product or the worth of your product to society. The question before us was the use of your data to help us make better decisions. Now, Mr. Chairman has pointed out that that's the law. We may not like it, but that's the way the law is written. I understood Bob's discussion to say that, in fact, it doesn't mandate that the industry can relax that or waive that if they care to some intermediate level or fully. So that's the frustration in front of us, is I still haven't heard an answer to Stu's question. What competitive advantage do they give up by sharing that data in a transparent way with us? And is there, in fact, any opportunity for them to move to the middle with their data to help us make better decisions?
I would give you an answer to that if I were in marketing, but I'm not. And I'm no longer part of management of any one of the companies. I guess one of the things that strikes me is that the biomedical mortality is not a huge number. If it's in this, let's say it's 60,000, all right, make it 75,000. And you divide that by 3 and put 25 in the north and 25 in the middle and 25 in the south, and you've basically got a number for your stock assessment. So, and again, that's that's a number that you calculate on the back of an envelope, because we really don't know whether it's 8% or 12% or 5% or 15% mortality. You know what it is in the bait industry because they report it every month.
Okay, thanks. So moved, Pat says. I think this has been helpful, and I'm mindful of the time in large part because I have to be on a plane fairly soon. So I think what we'll do is, Rob, go ahead, because I did have you on my list, and then Maren has one more piece to report, and then there's another industry member that had some input for us.
Yeah, my question is still on the issue of confidentiality, and I guess there was a slide there on the pros and cons of if the data were made available and the stock assessment process felt that our stock assessment committee would feel the public would not know what was going on, or the board, or however that was looked at. And so in fairness, my question would be, since data confidentiality surrounds us with many different species, are we in that position with other assessments? And I know there's a focus here right now on horseshoe crabs, but is that also part of what we face with other assessments, or is this to an elevated degree?
Yeah, I think most of this group is on several boards, and I've shared a few times, the personal frustration I had with lobster management, which was, pretty high profile species for the commission, that we couldn't even look at data that would show effects of a season closure state by state. Monthly landings, state by state, could not be shared in Addendum 17 because it might be confidential for someone. So that it has posed an obstacle, even in the most abstract way. That I've said at home, to know who landed, what that February 2011 Connecticut landing was. To know what somebody landed, you'd already have to know so much about the industry. You probably already know what the guy landed, because I know what I landed, I know what you landed, so I can figure out what Pat landed, that sort of thing. But it is a common problem. I think for Menhaden, that would be the extreme example. If Omega just decided they wouldn't share their landings with Virginia and the Commission, we'd be in quite a fix on Menhaden management. But so it exists in some fisheries and not in others. But I do want to keep moving, so Maureen's going to help us do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is just the second half of the Biomedical Working Group report dealing with the increase in total number of crabs killed by the biomedical sector. And as I mentioned, in 1998, this was approximately 2% of coastwide mortality, and in 2012, it's now about 10% of the coastwide mortality. And this might be partially due to constraints on the bait harvest, and as John has mentioned, this increased number of dead crabs may be having an effect on the population, which is why it's come to our attention. So there are two possible solutions for this issue as well that the working group discussed. The first was to mandate the use of bled biomedical crabs in the bait industry. For example, Massachusetts harvests crabs for bait, gives them to the biomedical industry to bleed, and then uses those same crabs in the bait industry. So all biomedical crabs would enter the bait industry under this option. It would increase the mortality in the biomedical sector to 100%, but it would reduce the overall mortality along the coast. And so potential issues with this, as I'm sure you can imagine, there are some the short seasons for harvesting horseshoe crabs commercially would impede the biomedical industry's ability to meet their demand. They need a steady flow of horseshoe crabs year-round. It's unclear how the bleeding impacts the effectiveness in the bait industry, and so some further discussions and investigations would be needed for that. Using bait crabs in the biomedical industry may present challenges that need to be explored that we haven't even come up with yet. And there are a couple states, South Carolina and New Jersey, that do not have a bait harvest, so those biomedical companies would need to continue harvesting from the ocean. And so that's all I have for mortality. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions for Maureen? On that? Seeing none, I did want to hear from Benji, if you want to come up.
Benji Swan from Limuli Laboratories. I work in the state of New Jersey. I think I passed around the letter so you can all follow along. I am actually going to read the letter so I don't make any mistakes, because my biggest critic is in the audience, and that would be my 17-year-old daughter, Catherine. So, dear members, I do not support the use of biomedical crabs for bait. I am proud to be an American manufacturer of Limulus amoebocyte lysate, the only product other than the archaic rabbit test required by the United States Food and Drug Administration to test the safety of vital drugs, solutions, and medical devices for humans. I am equally proud to manufacture the product with a renewable resource, the horseshoe crab. Dr. Cooper, along with others, recognized the value of maintaining this renewable resource and protected the horseshoe crab with a return-to-sea policy at the onset of the industry in 1973, more than 40 years ago. I attached a short paper that I wrote in 2009 discussing the history of lysate and also the return-to-sea policy, which you may read at your leisure. In the manufacturing process, a huge majority of the horseshoe crabs survive, although a small number may perish. Biomedical companies continue to strive to keep this small number as low as possible. In fact, 15 years ago, when the horseshoe crab management plan was enacted, a threshold number was inserted to address the number of horseshoe crabs that do not survive the process. This number ensured that the biomedical use of the horseshoe crabs was documented and monitored. The number is calculated by assuming a 15% mortality of the total number of bled horseshoe crabs. Thus, the number increases as the biomedical collection of horseshoe crabs increases. For the last several years, we've exceeded that threshold number, which is not surprising as the health industry is advancing and expanding as our population grows and new drugs and medical implants and devices are discovered. It should be mentioned that the increased demand is countered by technical improvements in the use of the product. The threshold number was not meant to limit the availability of horseshoe crabs to manufacture this critical human health product, but to trigger a closer look at the industry's effect on the ecology of the horseshoe crab population. Since exceeding that number, biomedical companies have responded by discussing and formalizing best management practices to guarantee that the number of horseshoe crabs that perish remain as low as possible. Eradicating our renewable resource has the potential of destroying our industry and negatively impacting advances in human health and medicine. I also, as an aside, I just wanted to mention that what the biomedical companies are concerned about, the confidentiality issue, is that the information can be published any which way, and it can be put out there for other groups to use to harm our market. And I do want to say that all biomedical companies supply extensive data to their state, and it is forwarded to the Atlantic States Marine Fishery Commission. And I took this off some of the information that I report to my state. The information supplied includes, but is not limited to, fishing collection data, name of the collector, the boat name, the date of collection, method of collection, area of collection, estimated number of horseshoe crabs rejected on board the vessel due to mortality, severe injury, minor injury, small size, and other reasons, number of crabs collected, transported to bleeding location, number of males, number of females, number of trawls, duration of trawls, number of males each trawl, number of females each trawl, size of net, foot rope, mesh size net, and cod end. The bleeding facility information includes number of horseshoe crabs transported to the bleeding location but not selected for bleeding due to mortality, severe injury, minor injury, small size, and other reasons. Number of horseshoe crabs accepted for bleeding, disposition of the crabs rejected at the bleeding facility, date of release, area of release, number of released horseshoe crabs which are dead or severely injured. So we supply extensive data, and to think that we are not supplying data is just wrong. The different groups look at the information, and we have no problem with that. It's just where that information is going to be publicly put out and in what form. And I would take any questions if you'd like.
Great, I appreciate that. I'll offer your daughter the first shot at taking your presentation. Looks like she's declining. So, anyone on the board have any questions for Benji? Pat?
I do, and you'll think I'm off the wall and being facetious, but rabbits grow a hell of a lot faster than horseshoe crabs. And there's a byproduct. They taste good. And I'm not being a smart aleck about it, but and this advance from rabbits to horseshoe crabs is a great one. The product is great. I'm here because of that product. But we're back to reality. And if the other producers do exactly what you do and supply that information, then I have to ask our technical committee, why do they not have it? Now, why don't you have access to it? If they don't have access to it, and apparently that's the problem, we need the total number so that they can do what they have to do, and we can make our hard decisions. It's awful difficult for us sitting around this table pulling numbers out of the air or guesstimating. Dr. Cooper, you're right. There could be 50, it could be 60, whatever that number is, and you could tell us that. But unless there's verification here, it's not that we don't trust your word. It's that they need verification, and we, the board, have to go back to our states and talk to our people and tell them we made a decision based on what. And sometimes the data we have is very poor, but it's the best we have. And when we have inadequate data, we try to get enough so that we can make an honest, reasonable decision. And again, one bad decision here, it rolls, and it gets bigger and bigger. And next thing you know, you're making an addendum to an amendment to another addendum to another amendment, and you've got a monster on your hands, and then you've got the public on you. And we've got 15 states around this table that are affected differently by every decision we make. So I think, I'm very passionate about the process. I'm very passionate about sharing with industry. Every person around this table is very passionate about our user groups. And we're very passionate about the impact that we have, and when we raise our hand, when we take a no vote, it means we couldn't come to a consensus, but it's on the record forever. And all we're asking here is a solid piece of information that the technical committee can get their arms around to do a great job with the stock assessment, which will be the driver probably for the next 5 or 10 years. And I don't mean to pontificate, but I always do. And I'm the old guy, and I'm the oldest one in the room, and I can do it. So I would hope that you folks would supply that information, whoever is withholding that information, to help us. And we want to help you.
Right. Well, remember that
thanks,
horseshoe crab number is a speculation, a very soft calculation. It's not a hard number like reporting a harvest.
Okay, hey, Pat, you made your point. That was perfect. Perfect. Not at all vague or obtuse. Alan, did you want to comment? And then I think what I'll do is promise that we'll continue to work with this issue of access to the data that clearly has been provided in great detail. And I appreciate your thinking of my flight schedule, too. Thanks, Pat.
I'll keep it very brief. My name is Alan Bergenson. I'm with Lonzo Walkersville. I can confirm everything that Benji said regarding the numbers and types of data that we report to the state of Maryland. We report exactly the same thing, even up to the coordinates to where the horseshoe crabs were dropped off the coast. And I'm also the company my company is the one that makes the alternative assay. So if anybody had any questions about that, and what Jim said is pretty accurate. It's not so much that it's not regulated by the FDA, it's that it's not in the United States pharmacopoeia. And companies are required to use this assay because it's in the United States pharmacopoeia to release their parenteral drugs and implantable medical devices. There is no choice. So companies choose to use what is in the United States pharmacopoeia. To use the recombinant product is an alternative assay, and there is additional validation and cost that goes into that, and our customers, unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry is reluctant to spend that extra money to use an alternative test.
Okay, thanks. I think that helps a lot. As I said, I think one of our issues to work on between this and the next meeting is to get input from the Law Enforcement Committee. As you acknowledged, in your state, there may be a significant level of unreported harvest on the bait side. So there's a lot of unknowns here, and horseshoe crab management started at a time when we had very little data. In fact, I'm remembering that my agency didn't even have statutory authority to manage horseshoe crabs, and we had to get it to implement the commission plan and begin to collect data. So, when we started where we were, and I think we're looking to take that next step to a little more, a little higher level, more quantitative assessment and management. So, if there aren't more comments, I think that's what I would say is the point we're at. We'll get more information from law enforcement. We'll work on myself as the chair and with staff and talking with industry about how we manage this confidentiality thing and still get a really usable stock assessment that we can then roll into management to make sure that we do turn this resource around, as we're obligated to do. Pat?
Mr. Chairman, can they report back in May of what progress they made from this meeting to that meeting?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay. Dan?
Yeah, could I ask Marin to maybe communicate to the technical committee a request to do some field trials with the artificial bait this year? Maybe we could make some progress on substitution?
Yes, I will communicate that.
Great. Anything else? Roy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to David for bringing up the very topic I was going to bring up, and that is just something to be thinking about in the future. And Dr. Cooper alluded to the artificial bait and the potential utility of it. Maybe we ought to consider, and this may be a heretical suggestion, but just consider taking a more proactive step. What if, and this is just theory, what if the states collectively decided that you couldn't use more than a fifth or a tenth of a horseshoe crab as bait? In other words, almost mandating the use of the artificial bait, which had a 12th to a 15th of a horseshoe crab, if my memory is correct, as one of the attractive components in the artificial bait. But thinking along those lines, what if we took that step proactively, if that's within our purview, and thereby driving the fishery towards the use of artificial bait, something of that nature, and maybe we could get around some of the problems associated with the New York and New England harvest and that kind of thing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a good thought for when we get into that mode of responding to whatever we learn from a stock assessment, how many crabs are a safe level to remove. And Dan was suggesting a different angle of managing the demand, a different angle of managing the demand as you are, and that would be how many traps are being fished in the other fisheries we manage, whelk and eels, for example. So those are two kind of innovative approaches to, in this case, horseshoe crab conservation. So I think they'll all be on the table for that day. Tom.
I'll try and make it quick for you, Dave. I guess a couple things. As we go forward, I think the board should give some serious thought to Jim's idea, Dr. Cooper's idea about, that 57,000 may have outlived its life, and whether or not it needs to be bumped up to another level so we evaluate in the future or just remove it, and trying to accept the policy of you trying to get the least amount of mortality, recognizing the worldwide benefit of this product. And with that, I'm not certain, but it'd be interesting to see if the PDT can identify any best management practices that the board may want to consider being mandatory. I'm not sure. I would expect that most companies are doing the best they can, but if there are lessons learned, I know we've adopted some pretty stringent BMPs in Maryland, but if there are some standards that we should consider making mandatory and being enforced at the state level, that could help with this mortality issue as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Marin?
So I wasn't really a part of the development of the best management practices, but from what I understand, they've been developed to their furthest extent, and they've been recommended to each of the companies, and each company has such different practices that having mandatory practices would be a little bit too stringent on them. So that's how I understand it.
But from the information they've provided, it does seem that they've developed the best management practices and have implemented it. But I think it would be good for the board, to see those and understand those clearly, and if you have those fisheries in your states, I'm guessing states that do already are better tuned in, but it strikes me that in terms of proactive suggestions, that maybe it's time for us to send some stronger signals to our industry that you need to find ways to reduce your demand for horseshoe crabs, because it's becoming a concern, and there are things that can be done, and kind of put those ideas out to them, and help them anticipate what direction we might be going in here in management. Any other thoughts from the board on this? Any other business to come before the Horseshoe Crab Board? Pat?
Move to adjourn, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for the kind words. Going to miss you.
Thanks, Pat. We stand adjourned.